Hi, hello, welcome everyone. We're just waiting for everyone to join, but we will be starting slowly. If you want to introduce yourself on the chat, that it's more than welcome. But I wanted to also welcome everyone on behalf of Reconfigurations, Disability Studies in Central Eastern Europe platform. It's great to have you all for it's great to have you joining the next seminar of our platform. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, just a quick note that this is a platform that is hosted at Jagiellonian University. And we have been active for past couple of years when we've been also archiving the seminars that we've been holding. So in case anyone is interested in seeing or looking at and exploring like our previous sessions, my colleague will put also the link in the chat, so you can also explore other topics that we've been having. And the main aim of the platform, Disability Studies in Eastern Europe, is really to rethink disability from within the perspective of this geographical focus. And yes, it's really great to see like new people joining us today. And today's session will be focused on refugees with disabilities. And the title of the session is Refugees with Disabilities, Are We Doing Enough? Lessons from the Russian war in Ukraine. And as I think we all know, this is like an extremely important topic given the contemporary situation in so many places of the world. But still, it feels that the disability perspective in both like understanding the situation of refugees with disabilities, but also in supporting refugees and but also asylum seekers and migrants and all people on the way is really insufficient. So today we're gonna be focusing on refugees from Ukraine, but I just, as we start, I just want to draw our attention to the situation of refugees, asylum seekers in so many other countries. Of course, in the context of Poland, it would be also people who are crossing the Polish-Belarusian green border. But if we look more globally, according to the recent UN data, we have an estimated 100 million people around the world that were forcibly displaced by the midway point of 2023 only. And these were people mostly, if we look at like the countries of origin of international refugees, we would see countries like Syria, Ukraine, Venezuela, Afghanistan, Colombia, Congo, Palestine, Somalia, Yemen, and Sudan. So today we will be like looking at the case of refugees from Ukraine as somewhat of a case study based on the empirical research that Magda will be talking about. But we wanted to recognize the broader picture of the situation of refugees. So let me now introduce our speaker for today, Magda Szarota, who is a PhD in disability studies. She's a human rights activist, policy-related advocate, and photographer. She specializes in technologies of social knowledge, including critical knowledge production, public policies, intersectional empowerment, cross-sectional social justice strategizing, and artivism. And since the beginning of Russian war in Ukraine in 2022, she has been involved in organizing evacuations of Ukrainians with disabilities to safety. Additionally, with Monika Nowicka, she established the Ukraine Emergency Fund by the Humanity in Action Poland. So without further ado, over to you, Magda, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Agnieszka, very much. Can you hear me? Just checking. Okay.
Yes.
Thank you, and thank you to the Disability Studies in Eastern Europe platform team for inviting me to lead today's meeting on this urgent and complex topic. So the experiences of refugees with disabilities, including those with pre-existing impairments and those who acquired them as a result of military conflicts and forced migration. As Agnieszka mentioned, this issue is particularly relevant given the various conflicts and wars worldwide, including the genocide in Gaza. So the disabling consequences of the fully fledged Russian war in Ukraine serve as one critical case study within a broader context. And this leads us to this central question of today's meeting, which is, are we doing enough regarding refugees with disabilities? And by we, I mean the immediate community of this platform, that is disability studies researchers, but also researchers from other relevant fields, as well as change makers from humanitarian sector and human rights organizations, because I can see that many of you have joined our today's meeting, and that's great. And because the complexity of the topic requires greater efforts to foster collaboration, this cross-disciplinary efforts are needed. So, for instance, integrating disability studies with migration and humanitarian studies, as well as more cross-sectional cooperation, that is, connecting academics with disabled people's movements and humanitarian and human rights organizations and watchdogs. And as my experience of this topic, my experience, but also experience of my other colleagues shows, particularly regarding our efforts to engage in, for instance, United Nations advocacy, our experience shows that really much more cross-disciplinary and cross-sectional cooperation is necessary because data and evidence is missing. So only through collaboration, we can actually gather data and evidence that is necessary for such advocacy, but also for legal actions, for historical records, all the while kind of trying to support those facing life's harshest realities. So now, how do we start such cooperation, or how do we begin? So I would say that one possible entry point is recognizing that the figure of a refugee with disabilities actually remains largely overlooked or misunderstood in advocacy, research, and immediate response efforts. And that is why I have to say that I strongly agree with Agnieszka Kosowicz, who is a respected Polish migration expert and president of the Polish Migration Forum. So when she was helping us to promote this event to her networks, she aptly emphasized, and I quote, "Are we doing enough? Indeed, not even to address the needs of the refugees with disabilities, but even to recognize their very presence," end of quote. And I would say that similar perspectives emerge, to just name a few examples, at Disability Studies in Eastern Europe conference that took place in Krakow in May this year, where insights on Ukraine were shared, including, and I highly recommend that intervention of Professor Daria Zawirsek, and you can watch that intervention because it was recorded, or an important intervention by Dr. Agnieszka Król and Dr. Natalia Pamuła, who addressed critical issues at the Polish-Belarusian border. I also recommend a recorded roundtable organized by Professor Cassandra Hartley that featured work, for instance, of Dr. Hanna Zaremba and Ivan Szmatko. So building on these premises and to guide our discussion, while hopefully raising new questions, our meeting is divided into three main parts. So to kick start our discussion, I will provide an example of collaborative research that integrated disability studies, migration studies, and humanitarian experience. And I'm referring to a project titled "The Capacity of Polish and Romanian Stakeholders to Support Ukrainian Refugees with Disabilities in the Metropolitan Areas of Warsaw and Bucharest," which was co-authored by me with great migration researchers, Dr. Monika Nowicka from Poland, Dr. Alexandra Deliu, and Professor Bogdan Voicu from Romania. Then in the second part, we will hear from two fantastic experts, Dr. Lidia Kuzemska, who specializes in migration studies, especially in the context of Ukraine, and Nino Gwatanze from the humanitarian sector. And I really look forward to engaging with them on several key questions that I have for them. And then when we kind of gather those various pieces of puzzle, we'll open the floor for a debate, and we really look for you to share your experiences, insights, suggestions, and any questions that you might be eager to explore together. So, starting with the research that I mentioned, that research was conducted institutionally as a collaboration between Collegium Civitas in Warsaw and Research Institute for Quality of Life at the Romanian Academy of Sciences, and it was financed by the Polish National Agency for Academic Exchange. And this research has been compiled into a really comprehensive, almost 200-page report and a toolkit where we present the analyzed data and propose concrete recommendations, as well as provide and foreground good practices, mostly drawn from the civil society sector. So I'm happy to share the report and the toolkit with anyone who is interested later on via email. But importantly, my aim today is not really go into much detail when it comes to the report, because you will find all that information in the report and toolkit, but actually provide more context about why and how we conducted the research, talk a little bit about key findings, as well as give an example of how combining the perspectives of disability and migration studies proved fruitful, in my view. So now, really briefly, let's recap the context. So the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022 triggered one of the fastest and largest refugee crises in Europe, with millions of Ukrainians fleeing to neighboring countries. And this unprecedented situation required immediate international action to provide humanitarian support. And in March 2022, the European Council activated the Temporary Protection Directive for the first time, establishing legal standards for the protection of the displaced person during a mass influx. And by the end of October 2023, nearly 1 million Ukrainians were under temporary protection in Poland, with significant numbers also in Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary. Now, why were we interested in Poland and Romania for our study? Basically, it was because of their geographical proximity to Ukraine, as well as their historical similarities, including a shared communist past, but also limited experience in handling large-scale immigration. And what did we aim to do with our research? Well, we wanted to collect data on the initial and ongoing stages of the humanitarian response, and to compare Warsaw and Bucharest, and to provide recommendations for both government and civil society actors. And how did we do it? Our research took place from July to December last year in Warsaw and Bucharest, and we tried to use a participatory research approach that integrated migration and disability studies frameworks and involved a wide range of stakeholders from both Poland and Romania, of course, including Ukrainian refugees and people with disabilities. And we really made efforts that those people are not only participants, but also partners in their research and experts. And we kind of tried to give space for them to share their insights and include it and we try to include it also in the recommendations. As for methods, we used various research methods such as document analysis, experts' opinions, group interviews, but also over 40 individual interviews with key stakeholders. And we feel that this combination of qualitative and quantitative data gave us quite a rich understanding of the challenges that refugees with disabilities faced. Now I want to go over some key findings, and now I will like to ask Agnieszka to share the first slide, please. Yep. Thank you. So as you can see, there are various dimensions of our key findings. First of all, when it comes to civil society response, we found out that civil society in both countries responded quickly, despite being unprepared. NGOs and private individuals took immediate action and provided assistance, often without waiting for the government initiatives. And the grassroots mobilization addressed critical gaps in the early stages of the refugee crisis. When it comes to initial support, the majority of assistance was provided at the borders as refugees arrived, and civil society actors focused primarily on reception and integration with, and this is important, with very little effort dedicated to organizing evacuations from Ukraine. When it comes to challenges and burnout, the high demands placed on organizations and volunteers in the first weeks and months of the crisis led to severe professional and emotional burnouts. And as you can imagine, despite this intense workload, the initial enthusiasm led to an influx of resources, largely from individual as well as corporate donors, both local and international. However, as the situation persisted, it was really hard to maintain this level of engagement that was at the beginning. As for communication and collaboration, a couple of key findings. So effective communication and coordination among various stakeholders were crucial for delivering services to refugees, especially those with disabilities. And personal and professional networks really played a key role in referring refugees to appropriate services. When it comes to disability solutions, NGOs definitely developed a lot of innovative support services that were tailored to refugees with disabilities. And these included, for example, bilingual or sometimes multilingual helplines, video communication, lines for deaf individuals, and information hubs in, especially in urban areas that refugees could use. When it comes to cross-border cooperation, what's important to state is that that international cooperation, especially when it came to early evacuations of people with disabilities, was vital. And collaboration between civil society actors across borders helped to coordinate efforts that were needed to ensure that refugees with disabilities found safety. No, can we see the next slide, please? Some other findings, the role of immigrants. That's actually a very important finding. That is, we found that immigrants living in Poland and Romania played actually a very important role in supporting refugees and refugees with disabilities. Their ability to bridge cultural divides and also the fact that they already had migration experience was they acted as a sort of cultural mediators for the refugees. And they offered guidance and fostered the sense of belonging of the refugees. When it comes to unmet needs, that's a huge topic, but really quickly, What I want to stress is that despite the best efforts of civil society, many needs of refugees with disabilities were unmet. The lack of established procedures, particularly in healthcare, and the absence of sustainable funding models created significant challenges. Not to mention, complex bureaucratic systems or shortages of various types of resources. When it comes to psychological support, the need for it was pressing, but also, unfortunately, largely unmet. The shortage of mental health professionals who spoke the refugees' languages, for instance, along with the absence of culturally appropriate diagnostic tools, made it difficult to provide the needed medical health services. When it comes to accessibility, as you may imagine, unfortunately, many reception centers or long-term facilities, housing facilities, were not accessible or adequately equipped with accessibility. So adapting these spaces to the needs of refugees with disabilities remains a critical and really ongoing challenge. When it comes to structured solutions, we found out that both countries need really kind of a better structured and policy-driven solutions to handle especially the long-term needs of refugees with disabilities. Next slide, please. Then the last couple of findings, in a nutshell, as you can imagine, you can read more in the report about them. Service quality, definitely there is a need to enhance service quality, and it requires investments in institutions, professional skills, and resources, but also this openness to learn from refugees with disabilities, because due to their experience, they are becoming experts in the topic. When it comes to contingency planning, the experience of responding to the refugee crisis really highlighted that there is this need to have it, and many organizations, as we found, were caught kind of off guard and had to adapt really quickly to the demands of the situation. So the ability to develop rapid response mechanisms, as well as learning from this experience, is essential for handling future humanitarian crises more effectively. There was also a lot of organizational learning that happened for both NGOs and public institutions, but the rapid growth and restructuring of organizations brought new challenges, particularly in finding skilled professionals. There were also a lot of language barriers, which made service provisions difficult. So that's also a very important lesson learned for the future. When it comes to NGO challenges, some of the findings are that the rapid growth of NGOs during especially this initial phase of the crisis created internal challenges for the organizations, such as communication issues and difficulties in finding skilled workers with appropriate language abilities, as funding from private donors and corporate sponsors began to fade with time. And so the sustainability long-term of those organizations became increasingly uncertain. And on the basis of those findings, together with Monika, Alexandra, and Bogdan, we propose concrete recommendations, highlight existing good practices to be followed by various stakeholders. And now I would like to return to the issue of, on the one hand, misunderstanding or flattening the figure of a refugee with disabilities, with how combining migration and disability studies could help us to address it. And to illustrate this, I will zoom in on one example from our research, how these approaches, combined approaches, enriched our exploration, especially of the diversity of refugees with disabilities. And those combined efforts also helped us to kind of bust some myths or challenge some existing stereotypes. But before I delve in that, let me show you 3 quotations from our research. And Agnieszka, if you could please change the slide. Agnieszka, would you like to read out the quotations? So there's a change of voice.
Sure, Magda. So the first quote is, unfortunately, there was such a situation that, for example, even in significant, well-known humanitarian organizations, we heard, but we don't support people with disabilities. And our surprise then was, how is that possible? Statistically, it's not even possible that there are no refugees with disabilities among them. And this is NGO focused on people with disabilities.
Yes. And could you read out the next quotation on the next slide, please?
Sure. Deaf people constantly feel as if they don't exist. They are pushed aside. I'm among those people and I always have to fight everywhere. I constantly have to show that I exist.
Thank you. And the last quote on the third slide.
So we at NGO also decided to take some action because we felt that someone needed to help people with disabilities who are refugees. We organized how shall I say, an evacuation, the evacuation of 12 people from Odessa to Poland, people with disabilities. And I also participated in organizing this. Many people from the NGO participated. It was the first such action we did.
Thank you. And so you can see these are the voices from the real life. And what we found out that regardless of what exists in life, there still exists a really dominant narrative that refugees with disabilities are, firstly, a very homogeneous group on the one hand, and a very dependent group. However, as we found out in our research, refugees with disabilities challenge this view with their diverse experiences, and their diversity encompasses not only different types of disabilities, but also socioeconomic backgrounds, ages, health conditions, etc., etc., etc. And as our research showed, some of them arrived with physical disabilities, while others faced mental health challenges or chronic conditions, which worsened by the trauma of war. And this highlights the importance of recognizing refugees with disabilities as a group with varying needs and experience and expertise. Another thing is that many refugees with disabilities traveled with family members, and by that, in a way, they countered stereotypes of disabled people being immobile or isolated or only dependent on institutional care. And this reality kind of tells us a lot about their own agency, and it also emphasizes the need for support systems that consider the family context, providing resources for both people with disabilities, but also their families. Another aspect is the quite really narrow understanding of disability within humanitarian and migration circles. So that is why we think that, because of that narrow understanding, a lot of accurate data collection was a challenge. And without accurate data, it is hard to support refugees with disabilities accordingly. So for instance, in Poland, organizations struggled to determine the number of refugees with disability due to the crisis' rapid evolution, but also, as I said, the inconsistent or very narrow definitions of disability. Moreover, the stigma attached to certain types of disabilities, especially so-called non-apparent or so-called invisible ones, further complicates this issue. So we found that many disabled people were hesitant to disclose their conditions, which further led to gaps in understanding and support. And this led us to the finding that there is a bias against so-called visible disabilities. And we found out that often aid organizations prioritized people with visible disabilities, such as those in wheelchairs, while often overlooking those with less apparent needs, like mental health issues. And this bias can lead to an inadequate support for many refugees with disabilities, sometimes prompting people to even fabricate visible impairments to gain attention. So a more nuanced understanding of disability is essential to provide comprehensive support that addresses both visible and invisible challenges. We also found out that considering intersecting factors such as, of course, gender, age, ethnicity, or mobility, etc., is really vital when examining the situation of refugees with disabilities. So while the narrative of refugees often focuses on women with disabilities, older men, for instance, with disabilities, as we found out, also faced significant challenges, including mobility issues and access to age-appropriate healthcare. And there's also this assumption that disabled people are immobile, and this notion has been challenged by the experiences of refugees with disabilities, many of whom viewed Poland and Romania as temporary stops on their journey. And this fluidity in the refugee experience really requires adaptable support structures. And importantly, the stereotype around passiveness or dependence of refugees with disabilities was also debunked in our research, as many of them, as we show, became active in various activist efforts, including existing disability movements. To sum up, our research evidences that by combining disability studies, migration studies, and other relevant fields, we can broaden our understanding of disability in the context of displacement, war, and also enrich our academic theoretical debates on what, for instance, constitutes disability. Or we can explore further the notions on mobility or immobility, as well as the role of disabled people's movements concerning the notion of the refugee with disabilities. Now we come to the second part of our meeting, and I want to invite two great experts from migration studies and the humanitarian sector to add more pieces to this complex picture. And we still have this overarching question that we want to answer. Are we doing enough regarding refugees with disabilities? And first, I would like to ask and introduce Dr. Lidia Kuzemska, who is a sociologist with an interdisciplinary interest in forced migration, internal displacement, borders, and citizenship. And she is a 2024 Prisma Ukraina Fellow of the Gerda Henkel Foundation at the Forum Transregionale Stadien and academic coordinator of the research group War, Migration, and Memory. And her doctoral dissertation entitled "Don't Be Afraid of Our Citizens, Internally Displaced People and Encounter Bordering and Othering in Ukraine," focused on the counter-hegemonic citizenship practices of especially internally displaced persons between 2014 and 2016. She's also a research affiliate at the Internal Displacement Research Program at the SOAS University of London and a peer reviewer for the Knowledge Platform and Connection Hub. And Lidia, welcome. Thank you for finding the time to join our platform's meeting. And the first question that I have to you is, as an experienced researcher in the area of forced migration, especially in the context of the Russian war in Ukraine, what are some of the key gaps, would you say, exist in current research? And where do you see the need, especially for the cooperation between migration and disability researchers?
Thank you, Magda, for the kind introduction. So I have several top key points that I want to cover. So first of all, I think we have a lot to learn and in our cooperation between migration and disability scholars in the decision-making process of people with disabilities who are in a situation of when they are forced to choose whether to stay or to leave. And we should think about this as a continuum between the situation of war, internal displacement, refugeehood, and potential return, because these things are connected. So how people are deciding where to go, how to evacuate, how they decide about the country to which they will go. Migration networks, I think this is something that we don't have enough information about. This is might be very different from other groups of people who are in need of leaving their homes. And this is somewhere that we can think about of potential cooperations. So just to give you a glimpse, so for instance, according to the latest International Organization for Migration report from August 2024, 29% of IDP households, so those people who are internally displaced, report that they have at least one person with disability. This is a much higher percentage compared to the average number of people with disabilities across Ukrainian population, and 28% of returnee households, so those people who are returning after being displaced either inside the country or outside the country, are also reporting that they have at least one person with disability. So this means for us that a lot of people, disproportionately more people with disabilities, are displaced compared to the average, their proportion in the Ukrainian population. We can also think about another gap. It's the different integration experiences, as Magda has already highlighted, of different groups of refugees with disabilities. In particular, we have very little information about children displaced with their institutions abroad. We know that some, for instance, the Ombudsman Office of Ukraine are dealing with these issues, but they are dealing this mostly from the legal perspective. We have very little information about the social situation, and so I think we need to learn more about this. Another group that is quite specific would be veterans who are going for medical evacuations, rehabilitations abroad, that we also, so far, we don't really have any research on them, especially if they are abroad. Another quite sensitive topic would be the use of disability certificates as an enabler of leaving Ukraine in the current situation. It's a very politicized issue, which undermines the disability certificates as such, and their validity are being questioned inside the country. And of course, the recognition of the Ukrainian certificates abroad is also questioned. Apart from non-recognition of disability certificates of one EU country in another EU country. Which brings me to another gap, is what will happen after the end of the Temporary Protection Directive. We now know that it will be extended for 1 more year, so it will be valid until March 2026. But we don't know what will be the EU decision afterwards. And what we might expect there, the increasing fragmentation of this protection framework in different countries. So different countries will apply different rules, and we don't know what kind of national framework they will apply to, they will provide to people with disabilities to apply. Because one of the biggest concerns for host countries is so-called integrability, which means that people are pushed to take any kind of employment and to become self-sustained as soon as possible, which might be challenging for some people with disabilities. And we don't know which national frameworks of protection or employment or other statuses people with disabilities from Ukraine will be having in different EU countries. And it brings me to another question of secondary mobility, so mobility of people with disabilities within the European Union. And I assume this will be very much limited, because countries will establish rules and regulations that will say that some groups are that they will not that they will not allow people from Ukraine to move to these countries anymore because of the end of the Temporary Protection Directive. And a final point I want to mention is the situation of people with disabilities on the occupied territories, and those people who have been deported from the occupied territories. For instance, the whole institutions were deported to Russia, and we have very, very little information about the situation of these people. We know that they have been forced to take Russian citizenship in order to receive any kind of medical or social help or any kind of support, but we have very little information. So these are some of the gaps.
Thank you, Lydia. In about 5 minutes, you actually gave all the arguments why the cooperation between migration and disability studies is essential and timely. And my second, quick question before we move to Nino pertains to the, I would say, ethically sound research methods, which you think might not be so commonly used yet, but that you found to be particularly valuable in capturing this refugee experience.
Mm-hmm. So, in answering your question, the codes of ethical conduct of research with forced migrants so far doesn't have any specific guidelines about conducting the research with people with disabilities in refugee context. So we don't have any specific recommendations. We can only talk about the general recommendations to such principles as do no harm, informed and voluntary consent, being beneficial for the people, always be mindful of our own positionality, power imbalances, how to make the research outputs accessible to the research participants, thinking about, do we need this research at all? Are we the right person to do this research? Constantly being reflexive about what is the point, what is the purpose of this research, who is funding the research, what would be the benefit for those people who are involved. In particular, I think in terms of people with disabilities, the question of gatekeepers would be very important, how to work with them. The question of informed and voluntary consent would be very important to address as well. And I would say also the question of compensation, because in some contexts we know that people are investing their time and effort to talk to us. So what would be the appropriate compensation in this kind of context? Yeah, I think that would be the main points. In general, my suggestion would be to remain reflexive in choosing any method, and then having this as a continuum. It's not a continuum of during the whole process of research, from the design until the delivery of the results.
And even the dissemination.
And the dissemination.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Lydia. And now I would like to introduce Nino Gvetadze, who is an independent consultant with over 15 years of experience in humanitarian and development sectors across Africa, South Asia, Central and Eastern Europe, as well as the Middle East. And her expertise focuses on advancing disability rights, risk-informed programming, resilience, and learning in humanitarian crises, including conflicts and wars, but also natural disasters. She specializes in amplifying the voices of the rights of marginalized communities, particularly people with disabilities, through inclusive policy development and programming. And Nino's impressive work encompasses strategic oversight as well as hands-on technical support and the creation of actionable tools, I would say, to promote disability inclusion. And over the years, she has built a strong relationship with grassroots organizations with people with disabilities, UN agencies, fostering a partnership that actually prioritize locally led initiative for greater equity and inclusion. So welcome, Nino. Thank you that you found the time. And I know that in Georgia, it's a really busy time right now when it comes to the elections. So I'm really grateful that you are with us and you will provide a bit of perspective from the humanitarian sector. So my question to you is, based on your extensive humanitarian experience, especially in various affected areas, but also your work as a researcher and advocate, what would you recommend to disability studies researchers in terms of the most urgently needed research on refugees with disabilities to strengthen humanitarian response? And maybe there are some good practices in this area that you could share with us today already.
Thank you, Magda. I'm really pleased to be here today to be discussing about the situation of refugees with disabilities in humanitarian settings. And thanks to Lydia also for very interesting insights. First, I like to draw attention to the fact, what you've also mentioned, Magda, that there are no official statistics on the global prevalence of disability within the displaced populations. So, for example, UNHCR uses the global prevalence of the World Health Organization estimate of 16%. And if you take that to the global displaced population numbers, then it comes down to around 18.2 million forcibly displaced persons with disabilities, but these are just the estimates. So people with disabilities are, we all know, disproportionately affected during humanitarian crises. They face higher protection risks and significant barriers to inclusion. That situation is even worse in the displacement settings. There are a few aspects that I wanted to highlight as the major gaps and also share a couple of good examples of collaboration. I think in terms of the gaps, the biggest one really relates to the data collection and disaggregation, because if we don't have the data on refugees with disabilities, first of all, numbers, and then secondly, the barriers. What happens often, we might get the data, but that's where we stop. So what I've seen in many cases is analysis of the data is not happening properly or data is not being utilized. What is often also lacking is the qualitative research. So I'm really happy that you actually presented your study. This is something that I can refer to in my future work as well. We need more research like that, which actually goes to the nitty-gritty details of what are the key barriers, what are the key issues, what are the key requirements that persons with disabilities, considering their diversity, face. And I think you have mentioned somewhere that sometimes people with disabilities are presented as a homogeneous group, and we need to be very, very careful about that. So what I've seen very oftentimes is people with so-called invisible disabilities are forgotten or unseen. So I think there is need for more focus there. And need for more work and study to understand the specific risks and the resilience factors of the displaced population, because they have unique factors that influence their resilience. And I think it's really important to support building those for the resilience building of the displaced populations. Another difficulty relates to like longitudinal studies on the service outcomes, because most of the research focuses on the immediate needs or the short-term outcomes, and then there is a gap in understanding the long-term impacts of displacement on people with disabilities. So for example, how does access to or lack of medical care affect their condition over time, and what are the long-term socioeconomic impacts? I think these are the main critical gaps, and I really would like to highlight the importance of academia and the practitioners collaborating. And I wanted to bring one good example of Leave No One Behind project. It's something that started out in 2016 with the support of the German government's funding, and it initially involved two disability-focused international organizations, Humanity and Inclusion, formerly Handicap International, and then CBM International. In the second phase, it actually expanded. So they started collaborating with the Bochum University, Institute of Law of Peace and Armed Conflict, which then moved very successfully to the third phase of collaboration. So what did that bring? Especially in the second phase, that was the period when the YAS guidelines on the inclusion of persons with disabilities in humanitarian action were being developed. So the three partners collaboratively have actually done a lot of work to contribute to the development of the YAS guidelines. And what is happening now in the third phase is again really good collaboration between the two disability-focused / humanitarian organizations and the university, looking into the operationalization of the YAS guidelines. So a lot of trainings and capacity development to humanitarian actors as well as OPDs has happened through that collaboration. The university was also involved in a number of researches in different humanitarian settings. The most recent one I remember is from Northeast Nigeria, also Kenya, really looking into the key gaps in terms of operationalization of the YAS guidelines in the practice. And we are actually working together now with the university to put together a book with some really interesting practical publications of practical approaches to making humanitarian action more inclusive for persons with disabilities. Another example is last year, my colleague from the University of from Indonesia, we worked together with UNDRR and UNHCR on a study of the situation of forcibly displaced persons in terms of disaster risk reduction and disaster preparedness. We really wanted to understand to what extent refugees with disabilities are involved in any disaster preparedness planning. Do they have any information about potential evacuation measures, risk reduction plans in place, to what extent they participate in disaster management efforts, and how are they engaged in the community structures, including with the OPDs. Because I want to highlight one gap. Very often humanitarian agencies, good when they engage with OPDs, even that is a problem, but OPDs themselves do not have information about refugees with disabilities. There is a disconnect. And actually this study, it was based on the responses from about 1,400 forcibly displaced persons from all over the world, which UNDRR collected. And it showed that these people are rarely, or basically their engagement is non-existent in any of these structures and decision-making platforms. So this was a good example because based on the key gaps, then a policy brief was developed. So this is something that UNHCR is now using, and UNDRR as well, for more advocacy to pay more attention to the critical areas in terms of disaster preparedness and risk reduction for forcibly displaced persons with disabilities. So I think there are some good examples out there, but there is definitely more need. And I think the academia has enormous potential of what it can bring. At the same time, humanitarians have like hands-on experience. And if there was more coordination, collaboration, exchange, maybe even before studies were designed at the conception phase, to have that like conversation, that would be helpful. And if there is a way to engage displaced persons with disabilities in those conversations somehow, that would be even better to inform the design of the studies by their voices.
Ooh, incredible. Thank you, Lydia and Nino, so much for your insightful and super important and inspiring also interventions. And I'm really grateful that you agreed, accepted my invitation to meet up with disability studies researchers. And within an hour, I think we already did a lot of it's like a thought experiment. How can we actually in practice collaborate cross-sectionally and cross-disciplinary? And to answer the overarching questions, are we doing enough? Obviously, there is so much more to do for us, but we are in good hands and in good company. And now we will move to the third part of our meeting, that is the question and answers, but also we really want to think of it more as a exchange of ideas, suggestions, maybe look for some synergies, because as you can see, we have people from humanitarian sector, human rights sector, academia, disability studies, migration studies, all those people are in the room right now. And before I pass the mic to Agnieszka, who will moderate that part, I wanted to stress that Dr. Monika Nowicka managed to join us. So she's one of actually the leader of the project that I was talking about. And so Monika is also in the room, so she's happy to answer your questions. And also the good news is that Monika will start another research project focused on the quality of life of refugees with also with disabilities. So that's like a kind of a continuation of what we did last year. So passing the mic now to Agnieszka.
Thank you, Magda, and thank you, Nino and Lydia and Magda as well for really super insightful interventions today. I think like we have covered a lot of topics, and I think this is now a moment for us to really ask questions, but as Magda said, also share any reflections, comments. But I think like there have been like so many topics being tackled at many different levels when it comes to cross-movement cooperation, different organizations working together, questions around like EU procedures, questions around like validity of disability certificates, a situation within persons with disabilities who are being institutionalized. But I think like what I wanted to say is also that maybe now is the moment really to unpack some of the aspects of this various conversations. I want to really say that apart from all of the information, the part of analysis that I wanted to highlight is also the part of resilience factors. And what you, Magda, have focused a bit on the kind of unpacking of stigma and stereotypes that happened with the whole situation. And a part of what you have mentioned about like mobility and also like the kind of care being given mostly in the institution, I remembered like also like a case that I think one of us was working on, that really also showed that like who is also a care provider, right? That many of persons with disabilities, refugees with disabilities, were caregivers to other persons, right? So which is an aspect that is also very often, I think, omitted. And obviously I have plenty of questions, but I would like to give the floor to anyone who maybe would like to come now to comment, ask anything. If there is, if you can put it and your questions on the chat, you can just use the raise your hand function or just unmute and we will give you the floor. Yes, Magda Szarota, please.
Hi. Thank you so much for this really amazing presentation from all three of you. I have a question. I'm not sure if it's the right thing to ask, but I will do this. I think that in disability studies, we are in the space of like celebrating disability as a unique way of being in the world and unique way of like thinking, but also of knowledge production. And I wonder if you have tackled this a little bit, but I wonder if there is a space for this like celebratory element in the research and in this topic that you are doing in terms of disability knowledge and practices and support networks. If in the context that we are talking about, is there something that we frame in disability studies as disability gain? So some specific advantages that comes with disability in comparison to other citizens. Thank you.
And the question is directed to all three of us. Okay. Would Lydia or Nino like to start? Or...
I think, Magda, you're more of an expert to answer this question than me.
I don't, yeah, but I wanted to be a good host. But I can
Magda,
start, of course.
I think also that Nino has already left because of a family emergency, so it's two of you.
Yeah, and the rest of disability studies researchers in the room.
Exactly.
This is this kind of lingering question that I also have, and especially when I moved to include in my, let's say, the variety of topics that I'm dealing, the issue of war, the incurred impairments due to conflict, war, and forced migration. This is quite of a new territory for me in a way, because before, 2 years ago, let's say, I was still mostly focused on the situations of people with disabilities in so-called non-conflict countries. Many years ago, I had like an episode when I was living and working in the civil war-torn Nepal. And this was the first time when I was exposed to this topic, but I wasn't really that aware of how disability studies could come into the picture because I was focusing on other issues at that time, research-wise. So in a way, for me, this is like a new chapter in a way. And I think it is something that we should be asking ourselves constantly, because there will be constantly this tension between not pushing disability as something not wanted by the society on the one hand, and the incurred disabilities due to wars and conflicts that we don't want in our world. So I think this is, it will, and it should be always in tension, in dialogue. But my immediate answer from the research that I've done with Monika, Alexandra, and Bogdan, let's say, is like, so part of your question, how refugees with disabilities can contribute to knowledge making, if I got it correctly, it's definitely treating them as experts, fortunately and unfortunately, for instance, in accessible evacuations. The work that they had to do, unfortunately, like do-it-yourself evacuations, because a lot of big humanitarian players didn't step up, or they were saying, we don't know how to do accessible evacuations. And this is where people with disabilities and their immediate allies kind of had to become experts from one day to another, how to save their lives, for instance. So when it comes to knowledge production, that aspect is something that we should look into more research. But it's kind of like a reflection when we look at the societies at peace, a reflection of treating people with disabilities as experts in accessibility in general, for instance, or how inclusivity can be broadened when we really put disability as one of the important puzzles in the picture. So that would be my immediate response.
Thank you, Magda. Is there anyone else who'd like to take the floor or share any comments? So there is a question from Victoria in the chat, so maybe let me read it out. So thank you for this great talk. If Romanian and Polish cases would be compared, what is the difference in terms of the role of national politics, the presence of NGOs, projects, and so on? So the comparison between the Polish and the Romanian cases.
Yes. And I would ask Monika to give a short answer, and then I can add on, because it's really great that Monika is with us.
Great. Monika, would you like to take the space to answer this question?
Yes, hello. Hello, it's so nice to be here, and I'm very grateful to Magda that she is presenting our research and that she invited me to join the meeting. I'm rereading the question. If Romanian would be compared, what is a difference in terms of the role of the... Oh, wait, something has moved.
So I can read it once again. So
yes, please.
Yeah, if Romanian and Polish cases would be compared, what is the difference in terms of the role and the national politics? What is a difference in terms of the role of the national politics, the presence of NGO projects, and so on?
And so on. I guess that the main difference is that in Poland, NGOs were the main stakeholders who took care of refugees with disabilities, as we called them. They were the strongest player, the player who did the most of the job. We were focused on Warsaw and Bucharest. And I guess that the clearest difference between the cities, not the stakeholders, was that who played the most important role. From our research and general knowledge, it seems that in Warsaw, City Hall was not a very strong player here. And it is the key difference between Warsaw and Bucharest, because in Bucharest, a lot of support was organized by City Hall of the Bucharest. From our research, and I guess Magda agrees with me here, it seems that Romanian NGOs are not so strong, and to some extent, I do not want to say well developed, but it seems that Polish NGOs are much more engaged in helping, especially in helping people with disabilities. And Poland has bigger experience in dealing with migrants as such. We have a longer, this is still short, but we have longer history of being a receiving country. So to me, it seems that this Polish field of helping is mainly based, not Polish, but Warsaw and Bucharest is mainly based in Warsaw. It was mostly based on NGOs. In Bucharest, it was City Hall. The facilities we visited in Bucharest, they were all facilities operated and run by various agendas of Bucharest municipalities. And NGOs were only supporting. They were present there. There were mainly these big international NGOs. And it was very difficult for me as a visitor there to meet someone who would be a local NGO, like from Bucharest, who would be supporting refugees. So to me, Bucharest is based on City Hall and international NGOs, and Warsaw was much more based on local NGOs. And international NGOs appeared, as we know, later on, and the City Hall as an actor who is very poorly present to me.
I would completely agree with what Monika said. And as a footnote, going back to why it's critical actually to combine migration studies with disability studies in this type of research is the fact that we were observing some phenomena. As Monika said, that some NGOs were more active, let's say in Romania, and some in Poland. And there was this question, why is that, for instance? And this is where, for instance, disability studies perspective helped, because we started to look at the history of the disability movement in Romania versus Poland. And it became quite obvious that Polish disability movement has a kind of more vibrant history, more diverse, rather than the Romanian disability studies movement. So because we were able to bring that aspect into our analysis, suddenly other findings started to make kind of sense. And also, Monika, do you remember when we were trying to reach out when we were leading the individual interviews with public stakeholders, and it was really difficult to have public officials to actually speak with us. And we thought, was it like in Poland, that it's like really difficult for people to agree to have those interviews. And then it turned out that in Romania, it was even more difficult in a way.
I will need to look at the structure of our interviews. But I guess that in Poland, majority interviews was done with NGO representatives. And in Romania, NGOs representatives were the minority of our interviewees. There were more public sector, not so much from the state level, because it was our case that we had these two interviews with state level actors. They were mainly focused on local government.
Yeah.
Thank you. And just maybe a follow up on what you said before we move to the next question. You were mentioning NGOs, but could you say a little bit about like the dynamic between like disability rights NGOs and maybe refugees kind of focus NGOs? Like was it like, was there a cooperation, or like if we compare Poland and Romania? And also like if we speak about NGOs, right? What about like the broader civil society, right? Was it like only like institutionalized kind of NGOs response, or would you see like also initiatives that are not formalized? And then I give the floor to Hannah.
In Warsaw, it was clearly and very visible, easy to see that there was, and I'm not sure, it was a year ago. So it was a great cooperation between disability and migration NGOs. This exchange of information, networking, who can be supported, how can be supported. If I am not able to support this person, organizations recommended another actors who can support. So, and when we talk to people, this was important in helping. It was important for the NGOs for their own well-being. And yes, here it was really important. In Bucharest, there was also a cooperation, but it was more vertical, in a way that if there was a local NGO, they do not support it so much local NGO with local NGO, but more local NGO with international NGO, as an actor who provides resources or knowledge or solutions. So in Warsaw, it was like more horizontal cooperation between NGOs, and in Bucharest, it was more vertical cooperation. Okay, and there was another part of the question which I already forgot.
No, it was only about like going like beyond NGOs, like about like any other kind
yes.
of non-formalized civil society initiatives to address.
In our sample in Warsaw, there was one person who was not part of NGOs, and he was of Ukrainian origin, and he helped to evacuate people from Ukraine. And he did support with he did cooperated with NGOs, but he was not formally part of any. From other research, previous one done at Collegium Civitas, we know that this engagement of civil society, like individuals, not NGOs, to help, especially during these first weeks of support when this humanitarian aid was necessary. It was quite big share of total helping in Warsaw. Of course, this group of helpers is at the same the one which burnt out very quickly and very easily. Because if you do not have this institutional, organizational support, this is very difficult for people to help. But yes, during these first weeks, it was also a very important part of this helping group. But with time, NGOs stayed only as main actors, with no support from individuals and no support from government, city hall, and other public actors.
Mm-hmm. Just a footnote to what Monika said, kind of like throwing into our basket of inspirational resources. I highly recommend you look up a project that was done by the Polish Forum of People with Disabilities, PFON, which is like an umbrella organization in Poland uniting disability-focused NGOs, and they did something quite extraordinary, I think. Namely, they ran a project that specifically aimed to look at the know-how that people with disabilities who were helping refugees with disabilities were gaining, especially in those early weeks and months of the crisis.
Thank you, Magda, for this addition. So I think that we have a couple of other questions. So let's go to the next one. Hannah, would you like to speak? Because I saw your hand was also up. If you want to present your question.
Hello, dear colleagues. I have already wrote my question in the chat. By the way, if you can read, you can read. But I want to thank you, Lida, Nino, and Magda, for this excellent research and presentation. My question was about: have you studied the influence of donor organization on the specifics of the provision of support and social services among organizations that working with Ukrainian refugees? Because if we talk about case of Ukraine, I have seen for the last year and a half that more and more grant givers are setting the focus to support and assistance. In this way, people with disabilities are categorized by disability groups. In Ukraine, we have the system of 3 groups of disability, or place of residence, displacement experiences, or age. Thank you.
Magda, do you want me to answer?
You can start, and then I can add again.
Okay.
A footnote or two.
Yes, this is a mode of operation which works for us today. No, we studied the influence of donors, but not in this respect you're asking us. We mainly focus on how presence of donors, meaning more money for NGOs, affected NGOs as organizations. So how NGOs dealt with upscaling, very sudden, very rapid, how they managed that process and how that process affected NGOs. We did not ask about how donors and money they bring affect help itself. So here I am not able to answer your question.
I think this is like a topic, a very needed topic for research, and also comparative research, in a sense, comparative in between countries, regions, but also in terms of like national donors, but also international players, because this is how we can see what kind of disability paradigms, for instance, are being operationalized. So definitely that's a topic to be explored. And Lydia also mentioned that in her intervention, that we should pay attention to where the money is coming from, and in a way also included as if we can in our analysis, if we want to unpack what is actually happening when it comes to positioning refugees with disabilities. How do we position, how do sponsors or you know, arms of the state in various forms want to impact where refugees with disabilities and then people with disabilities in society are positioned? That's one thing. But when it comes to our research, as Monika said, that was not the scope of our research. However, even if we could go back to our primarily data, and if we put this lens with your questions, there are things that could be untangled because I think that maybe not explicitly, but implicitly there were some issues. Like, for instance, migration NGOs were sometimes more willing to fall into the trap of the stereotypical understanding of disability, maybe due to their donors, we don't know. But let's say organizations of people with disabilities, especially those who are at the forefront of the disability movement, were rather, more, let's say, quote unquote, progressive when it comes to that. And maybe one of the reasons was that they were able to find appropriate sponsors, donors who acted as allies to their issue. But this is, again, as Monika said, this is not something that we really put under a microscope yet.
Yes, but maybe if we did some additional analysis, as Magda said, we could find more information. But there is something in what Magda says, because I remember one of the organizations I talked to, and the lady who was my interviewee, she told me a story that she negotiated with a donor to whom she can give the money, like on which group this money can be spent. It was not refugees versus people with disability, but it was Ukrainian war refugees versus refugees on Polish-Belarusian border. But yes, it shows that donors have their requirements on whom they wish to have their money spent for. So yes, for sure, this is for further exploration.
Completely agree.
Yeah, and very, very, very important topic. There is other discussion happening in the chat.
Parallel life.
Parallel life of our meeting happening on the chat, which is in relation to the lack of disaggregated disability data collection, which is a core challenge. This is a question brought by Killeen Barry. And what basically we can do worldwide to get standardized disaggregated data collection for all forced displaced persons with disabilities that can be relied upon. So I saw, Lydia, that you've been responding. I don't know if you'd like to maybe elaborate a little bit on that question.
I just wanted to provide, there is this working expert group on advising governments how to make refugee, internally displaced people and stateless people statistics better, and then how to make it disaggregated. But I think you would have to kind of dig into these recommendations to see to what extent different aspects of disability are covered or not covered in these recommendations. They are not even implemented in all countries. These are just recommendations. So we are talking about different state capacities and willingness to collect this kind of data. And the colleagues already mentioned that there are challenges that not all the people are able to confirm their disability in the host country. And then how long does it take to confirm it? And especially in Ukraine, you have very different procedure and there are different grades of disability, which is not the same as in different countries. I just wanted to add quickly to the previous question that donors have very particular logic about how they allocate money, and especially states who want to avoid big refugee movements to them, and especially people with disabilities, they would try to provide support in Ukraine to the groups who can be potentially moving out from the country. I remember we had a conversation with one of the stakeholders from one of the countries that are biggest recipients of Ukrainian refugees, and she bluntly said, "We are afraid that people with PTSD will come after the war as family reunification, so we will do anything possible to prevent them from coming." So you can imagine what's happening. So the logic is just to give the money away to keep the problem away from this problem moving to their country. So that would be, unfortunately, the logic of the states.
And do you remember, Monika, that example of this anxiety around people with disabilities coming also with HIV virus from Ukraine? Yeah, so kind of like another example of what you, Lydia, mentioned.
Well, thanks for calling out like this very ableist ways of thinking about international policies then, which unfortunately there is a long history in migration policies of that, right? Not only in Europe, right? I see there is something else happening on the chat. Okay, someone just has posted a link around another publication, but is there anyone else who'd like to comment, reflect, pose a question? It doesn't have to be a question, it can be also a reflection. Maybe there is someone, but please introduce yourself, as I think the name on Zoom does not reflect maybe fully your name. Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me well?
Yes, we can.
Yes, I'm Gina. I work in a Berlin-based OPD specialized in refugees with disabilities. And I apologize, I confused the time zones and I got here way too late, so maybe this question has been answered already. So what I would be interested in is, did you or were there any experiences with institutionalization? Since here in Germany, here in Germany, what's quite striking as primarily NGOs and later on state actors primarily placed Ukrainian refugees with disabilities in institutions. And there was a very interesting case where formally closed institutions because of our very slow but deinstitutionalization process. So an institution that has been closed for German people with disabilities was open for Ukrainians with disabilities. And I think these experiences or this this problem in general is very overlooked on this intersection of migration and displacement. And yeah, I was wondering if there were any experiences or any insights regarding the type of assistance and if it's institutionalized or yes. And if this has been answered before, I apologize. Thank you.
No, thank you so much for posing this question. It was also like on the list of my questions to go deeper into the institutions and the situation of people who lived in institutions. But this example is very stirring, and I also recall one of the comments from Professor Daria Zawirszek in the conference in May that that happened here in Krakow, where she said that in like for the disability rights movement, right, like if let's say when the institutions have been destroyed, for example, due to war, right, it also kind of has an impact on the dynamic of the institutionalization because the institutions don't exist, right? But the mentality is so strong of putting people with disabilities within the institutions that they are being rebuilt, right? And like how not to bring back this dynamic when it comes to other contexts. But over to you, Lydia, Magda, Monika, and also I don't know. I think like if I'm not wrong, Hannah, you've been also working on that. So if anyone else would like to add, please do.
Could we make a short reminder of the question?
Yeah, so it was a question regarding institutions, right, and relocations of persons with disabilities. In this particular context, I understand it was the context of Germany, where specifically people from refugees from Ukraine would be placed in the institution while Germany has undergone like the institutionalization efforts. So I think like any insights when it comes to institutionalization, disability, and refugee, and apologies for my dog barking at the back end.
Mm-hmm. It did not appear in our research as such, but once again, I heard stories outside. And what is important and what we know in Ukraine, if I am wrong, just correct me, but as far as I know, this institutional model of disability is still very much stronger than in Poland, not to mention Germany. So it might be the case that when you are evacuating institution, like hundred of people, it is quite natural to put them into institution, even though this is not our policy anymore, because how to find like non-institutional solution in a very short time when you evacuate institution, in fact. And this is the story I know from one of NGOs which helped to evacuate large institutions from Ukraine, and they follow this pattern. So maybe this is the case. I'm not sure if this is the answer, but this is from what I know.
Thank you, Monika. Anyone else would like to add anything on this one?
I can just add a few words about what's happening in Ukraine.
Yes.
I don't know any cases about institutionalization of Ukrainian refugees with disabilities abroad in the EU countries. I know that some institutions, closed institutions, rebuilt for Ukrainian refugees. I know this case from Netherlands, but it's like just a shelter right now, not institutions. But when we talk about Ukraine, yes, usually, as a colleague said previously, when some institutions from the front line evacuate more western, usually these people are putting in the closed institutions. We still have this tendency, and also what's it's like a big problem for me that in the center of Ukraine and west of Ukraine, some institutions are rebuilding from the government money or donors' money for IDPs from IDPs with disabilities from institutions. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. I just started wondering like how how it relates really this practice that you described, like how does it relate when it comes to Germany, for example, and like to EU policies on when it comes to the institutionalization, but also like the general guidelines on the institutionalization that have been issued like 2 years back by the CRPD committee, and whether they address anything when it comes to the institutionalization in the context of refugees and war, etc. I have no information on that, but just curiosity is leading me towards this question also. Magda, Lydia, anything to add from your end on this one?
I only know about the cases. There was institutions, orphanages that were evacuated from Ukraine to Italy, for instance, and because these are children, and then the head of the institution is official legal guardian of all of these children, and they are following Ukrainian governmental guidelines. They cannot kind of separate these children. They have to be with this legal guardian, and then this legal guardian just took the decision to return the whole institution back to Ukraine, and I think it was to Zaporizhia or to Dnipro. And then they had legal challenges from the Italian state, who was considering that this is not safe to return children to that particular location because it was under bombardment. And I think this caused also some tensions between Italian and Ukrainian government, but in the end, they returned because they were in the custody of Ukrainian government. So I don't think the host countries have that much say, especially in the case of children. I'm not sure how is it happening in the case of adults.
So again, another area to research, right? And join forces.
Definitely. And I think like it shows how like the different state of the institutionalization in different countries is like now like creating all these tensions. Okay, so I think that there has been like one or at least or two more questions from Natalia Pomua on the chat. One was to follow up on the question around if you could say more about the fear that people with disabilities from Ukraine have HIV. So I don't know if you want to, Magda, say something more about that. And then just to read out the question so that we can also start thinking about that. It's another question, I think, about unpacking this homogeneity that you spoke about, Magda, right? So Natalia is asking, like, were there cases of non-white people with disabilities? Basically, I'm asking about the intersection of race, disability, and migration. And in Poland, as we know, the border control tried to stop refugees of color from Ukraine. So I think it's a question of racism here, but I think that let's start with that. And if you want to also add later on any other intersectionalities, because I think, Lydia, you started speaking also about children, right? I don't know if maybe let's speak about HIV, race, and maybe if there is anything else you'd like to add to like help us unpack the homogeneity of refugees, and maybe if there won't be any more burning questions, we can slowly wrap up. But if there are burning questions, we can answer them, I guess. So over to you, Magda, if you want to elaborate on the first one.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this issue is an example of a topic that in a way appeared in our conversation sometimes, but it was kind of like off the record. Monika also gave an example that, some things were said, but you kind of had an impression that they wanted to be kept like off the record in a way. So at least I, as an interviewer, had an experience with at least, let's say, there were 2 instances when my respondents kind of hinted at this problem as a big problem for receiving countries, but also for organizations which do not have experience in the topic of HIV. So this also like opens up an issue of like intersection of disability, chronic illness, etc., which should be probably unpacked more. But first we have to have data on it and people agreeing respondents agreeing to actually talk about it more. So this is the only thing I can tell you, like, regarding the evidence I had, right? Like, off the record, hinted at, yeah. When it comes to the second part of your question, Natalia, so the intersection of ethnicity, yeah. Let me look at the chat. Intersection of race, disability, and migration. From what I remember, Monika, but correct me, or give a footnote. We heard about cases of in the case of Poland, for instance, of people with disabilities who have Roma, let's say, who are from the Roma community, and we also heard a lot of I would say tragic stories on how the dynamic between refugees within like those big reception centers was looking, and we kind of had an impression that there exists a hierarchy, not only when it comes to the types of disabilities which are supported, but also the ethnicity and race of given refugees. And we had an impression that some kind of like separate spaces were provided for various types of refugees with disabilities, depending on the type of impairment, but also one can say also depending on the race or ethnicity. But when it comes to an in-depth look into it, I'm hoping that at one point we will be able to join forces, for instance, with researchers who specifically have been doing very important research on the Roma refugees from Ukraine. And I'm specifically talking about, for instance, Dr. Elżbieta Mirga-Wójtowicz and her colleagues. They recently published a very important report on that. So I'm hoping we can join forces and maybe look together at the data they have and at the data we have, for instance.
Yes, maybe it is also worth to add that this problem of ethnicity and refugees was even more visible in Bucharest, especially with Roma people. It was not a very strong voice in Poland. It was much stronger in Bucharest in these interviews in Bucharest. Mm-hmm.
Lydia, anything to add from your end, even if like within a broader perspective of
I
how
will
the
just maybe
student
quickly
works
add
in
about
Poland?
the HIV. People with the HIV. Actually, in Germany, in Berlin, there is a very active group of Ukrainian refugees with HIV who established advocacy group, and they are working with the Ukrainian embassy and with the German Minister of Interior to speed up the process for those people who are coming from Ukraine with the HIV to access the medications as soon as possible, because the bureaucratic process to have this temporary protection is very long, and without this status, you cannot access the medication for free, go to the doctor, etc., to get the insurance. So they are very active, and I would say it's not a matter of fear; it's more a matter of practicalities and sorting these things. And it's not only about for the people with HIV, but for any kind of chronic diseases, the process of getting the status and getting support just takes a long time, and then the advocacy organizations are working on speeding up that process.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to say or comment on or reflect on this aspect or any other aspect? I think this question on racism, I think it also brings us not like to the beginning of the presentation, also, and looking at like which borders are being crossed by who, right? Like what are the migratory routes? Like what would be the, like if we would go out of the focus of this research that Magda and Monika conducted, right? Like what would be how this question would resonate if we look at the Polish-Belarusian border, if we look at detention places, etc. I think it's a very, very important aspect. I'm just watching like looking at the chat, but there is nothing else to add. I don't know if any of you would like to say anything still regarding like the age aspect and the children with this refugees with disabilities. Was it even like a big topic for your research, the age aspect?
A little bit. They were like more background stories. But what need to be focused on? These are unaccompanied minors. Yes, and we had stories of children like 6-7-year-old with their grandmas or some other members of family who are not legal guardians. And it made extremely difficult to have like official support for them because these grandmothers could not take any decisions. There were stories of children who for the first time attended schools in Poland, children with disability who were at home in Ukraine and for the first time attended schools in Poland. And generally when the topic of children popped up, it was somehow strictly connected to cultural differences in defining disability and how to deal with disability and what kind of support is good for the children and what is not. And sometimes these Polish solutions, when parents were convinced that, okay, let's try this new solution, it turned out to work greatly. And in some cases, it was even a decision to get back to Ukraine. So this is another field to explore.
Yes, and in the toolkit which accompanies the big report, we kind of aggregated typical case studies features, and you can also read about that. And there are a lot of examples with carers and children and family members and children. And as Monika said, the cultural aspect and the language aspect when it comes to children with disabilities was a big thing in our research. It came out like an important, let's say, factor in the process of, I don't know, inclusion or integration.
I can only add that we have to also keep in mind the distribution practices in different countries. So, for instance, in Poland, people have the choice to decide where they want to settle, whereas, for instance, in Germany, they are more or less mandatorily distributed across the country. So it will depend on where people end up, whether it will be a small community or with a big city. The integration capacities to include these children into different schools will differ. So it will not be the same for children depending on where they are in the country and between countries as well.
Okay, thank you so much for the discussion. I don't see any other comments on the chat and no other hands raised. So this is like the last moment if anyone wants to share any reflection or comment. If not, I think that I'd maybe like to bring us back to what Nino said, that academia has tremendous potential. And I think with this discussion, we have like really have tackled so many aspects of very much needed research, right? When it comes to the institutionalization, disability and migration, right? When it comes to intersectionality of refugees with disabilities, the situation in education, right? So just to name a few, I'm not going to summarize everything, obviously, from this rich discussion, but I think I want to bring us back to this potential of academia and how important it is to still like create these opportunities to produce knowledge and data. And yes, thank you so much to all the speakers. Thank you, Monika. Thank you, Lydia. Thank you, Magda. And thank you, Nino, who has left, for all the contributions. Big thanks goes to, obviously to you, Magda Szarota, for organizing this seminar for us. It's been really, really rich. And also, yes, a big hope for that the state of the world will reduce the number of people that are displaced, and that we will be able as humanity to kind of be in a better state, right? Because we are talking about humanitarian response, but also how, like, we need to talk about the causes, right, of what causes the situations. Okay, so with that, big thanks to all of you. And just as a reminder for anyone who'd like to maybe join any other seminars, next week, we're holding the seminars only once a month. So the next month topic of the seminar would be the institutionalization, in fact, and we will have two speakers from Lithuania who will join us to unpack the legal reforms that are happening, and we'll be also discussing their empirical research on the institutionalization in Lithuania, but also on legal capacity reform. So the two topics that are also like very, very important in the context of disability studies and social policies. And I guess also very interesting, we haven't touched on that at all, legal capacity when it comes to refugees with disabilities. Another prompt for much needed research, I guess, Magda.
Thank you so much again for the invitation. Thank you, Lydia, Nino, Monika, Agnieszka, and everybody who joined us. And yeah, let's get back to work. But first, free weekend so that we don't get burned out.
Yes, definitely.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you
Bye.
very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.